Hey there. Welcome to this very special midday live event version of this here Unorthodox podcast. We imagine you're sitting now at your home offices eating some leftover ramen from yesterday and tuning into this conversation. We're very grateful you're here. Before we begin, we want to thank our wonderful partners without whom this initiative would never have happened. So thank you very much. Temple Israel Center of New York, Temple Israel Center of White Plains, New York, the Weinstein JCC of Reading, Pennsylvania, Peninsula Sinai Congregation in Foster City, California, and Agudat Achim in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. As this is a live event, as we are imagining that you have other things to get to today, we are going to keep this very brief. The reason we're here is because today, October 27th, marks the 3-year anniversary of perhaps the most tragic moment in American Jewish history, the massacre of 11 congregants at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. My friend and co-host Mark Oppenheimer wrote an amazing book about it. You may have seen the glowing reviews in today New York Times. And we will release a very special episode of Unorthodox focused on Mark's book and on the Tree of Life shooting tomorrow. We'll tell you more about this later. I'm going to ask Mark a few questions, but much more importantly, we invite you to ask your questions. Remember, we're here to keep this short and sweet and informative and inspiring in the middle of the day. So please send all the questions that you have via the Q&A function of this here Zoom. And now, the bar mitzvah boy, the man of the hour, my co-host and friend, Mark Oppenheimer. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time amidst what I know is an international book tour.
Yeah, or at least intercoastal waterway. I actually swam in the Erie Canal the other day up in Rochester, New York. I've been in Rochester, I've been in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I was in Pittsburgh last night, and I have pulled off the interstate to do this. It's the only thing that could get me off of I-80 to talk to the wonderful people in this group that you've helped us pull together. And so thank you, Liel. It's good to be with this lunchtime crowd.
Deeply appreciated. Mark, I want to take you back to that Shabbat 3 years ago. I know you were driving your kid to a bat mitzvah, I believe, and then all of a sudden the phone starts ringing.
Yeah, so let me tell you what happened. We actually got that almost right. That's about 85% right. We had just been at a bat mitzvah at Temple Emmanuel in Newton, Massachusetts, the beautiful Temple Emmanuel, large conservative congregation in Newton, Massachusetts. We were there for the bat mitzvah of a summer camp friend of my eldest daughter, Rebecca's, someone she goes to Camp Ramah with. And I had driven her up that morning. We'd gotten there at 9:30 or 10 in the morning. We'd gone inside for the bat mitzvah. And then of course, we'd left our phones in the car, didn't want any technology in shul with us on Shabbat. And then we'd stayed for the luncheon afterwards. And we finally got back out to my car at about, I want to say 1 o'clock. And I fired up my phone and, there was just message after message. Are you going to Pittsburgh? Did you hear about Pittsburgh? What about Pittsburgh? What are we going to do about Pittsburgh? What's there to say about Pittsburgh? And I thought to myself, in my entire life, I've never gotten one text about Pittsburgh. Why did I get 30 on such a day as this? And so I navigated over to my news app and I opened it up and saw that there had been a shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. They didn't yet know how many were dead or what was going on. And I read a little bit and saw that it was in Squirrel Hill. And I must have looked very stricken because Rebecca, who was in the passenger seat next to me, said, "Dad, what's going on?" And I said, "There was a shooting of Jews at a synagogue in Squirrel Hill." And she said to me, "Squirrel Hill, isn't that where we're from?" And I said, "Well, not quite, but in a sense, yes." I knew what she meant. What she meant was, "Isn't that where Grandpa's from?" Because as she knew, my dad grew up in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. He was the 3rd generation of his family to be from Squirrel Hill and the 5th generation to be from Pittsburgh. So it's very, very deep. Squirrel Hill was founded as a community around the time of World War I, when the Jews began moving east out of the Hill District and Allegheny City and other neighborhoods of Pittsburgh into the newly settled Squirrel Hill, which was tough to reach because it was up on a hill. The trolleys actually had a hard time moving stuff up the hill, so it was really the frontier. And from the beginning, it was about 30% Jewish, and it is still arguably, especially if you include the adjacent East End neighborhoods, which are kind of contiguous, that part of Pittsburgh is still about a third Jewish. So I was really intrigued from the moment this happened. My my personal mind went to, I hope that nobody I knew was inside. But my journalist mind went to the question of like, what's going on in this neighborhood that has played such a pivotal role in my own family history.
So I want to talk precisely about this, about your journalist mind. We put together an episode right after this happened. We drove down the following day and did our best to capture the sort of live moment. But when you were deciding to write the book, you had a very different question to answer, a question of a different order of magnitude, which is, what kind of story am I going to tell? And I know, being myself a journalist, that this is quite a difficult endeavor, because the mind naturally wanders to, oh, okay, well, I'm going to see who the shooter was and what motivated him and his world and the victims. I mean, there's so many kind of deep avenues to go to, but you chose a very interesting path. Instead of talking about the shooter or about the victims, you told the story of the community, right? The neighborhood. How did you get to that conclusion? When did it become clear that this was the book?
That's such a great question. I should say right now, and I don't say this enough when I talk about this book, that I was very deeply influenced years ago by Dave Cullen's book, Columbine, which is about the two teenage boys who planned and executed the attack on their high school in Colorado. And that attack, the Columbine attack, really kicked off the era of mass killings in America. Before that, there had been occasional ones. But since then, they've been regular. There have been several hundred killings of 4 or more people in one event, which is how the FBI defines a mass killing. So, and that book, the Dave Cullen book, was really about the minds of the killers. I mean, it's really, and it's extraordinary how he goes inside their psychology using notes and diaries and stuff and tries to reconstruct what they had in mind. And I think that's one of the classic texts of modern journalism. But that said, it was never the kind of book I wanted to write. And from the beginning, I had for about 5 seconds and then very quickly dismissed the idea of writing a book about the killer. I wasn't interested in spending time inside a mind like that. And the more we knew about the alleged killer, that the anti-Semitic feelings, the anti-immigrant feelings, the time spent on the worst recesses of the right-wing dark web, the less I was interested in spending time with a mind like that. Just didn't hold any appeal for me. Another possibility would have been to write about the 11 victims, who, of course, were beautiful souls, each of whom deserves a book of their own. But that was also not the book that, in the end, I felt called to write. I wanted to do something new and different, which was to write a book about the aftermath, about how a neighborhood functions when the media are gone, when the cameras have left, when the news crews have left, and they still have to carry on and put one foot in front of the other and get on with the business of making a neighborhood and all of its institutions work. What is synagogue life like? What is public school life like? What's like in the library or in the kosher bakery or butcher in the week or month or year afterwards? So to me, the idea was to write a book in which the neighborhood and all of its just wild, crazy, wonderful, eccentric characters were the protagonist. And so that's the book I set out to write.
You and I have this history, this thing that we do in which you come up with really good ideas, and I'm very, very late to understanding that they're good ideas. I mean, famously, you tried to convince me to do this here podcast Unorthodox. It took me a while to figure out it was a good idea. And when you came and shared with me this idea that you're going to write a book about the Tree of Life shooting, my first response was almost to call back and be like, man, that sounds so depressing. Do you really want to be in that mindset? And yet when you read the book, I think, at least when I first, had the privilege of reading it, I was astonished by how deeply, deeply hopeful it was. Do you have the same sense?
Thank you. Yeah, it surprised me. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, because ultimately people are wonderful to write about. And if you really spend a lot of time with people, and I went to Pittsburgh 32 times over 17 or 18 months, and interviewed over 200 people, close to about 250, I say. And I fudge on that number only because there are conversations that I took notes on that didn't feel like formal interviews, but I ended up getting permission to use the content of the conversation. So do I retrospectively count that as an interview? It's hard to say, but hundreds of interviews, 32 trips. And of course, when you spend time, really deep reported time with people, you you quickly realize they're wonderful and they're eccentric and unique and have extraordinary individual stories. And how could a book like that be anything but hopeful in the end, even though something very sad and terrible has happened to this community? The writer Rebecca Solnit, who writes about the aftermath of natural disasters and war, has also made the point that people are often at their best when coming together after something terrible has happened to them. And you see this after Hurricane Katrina or Sandy, or in refugee camps, that often people are their most generous when each of them has the least. And so yeah, I mean, I think that looking back, that was pretty obvious, but I probably had the same worries that you did and was just putting on a brave face, which was that I'd start reporting on this and it would be so overwhelmingly sad that I wouldn't be able to handle it. I'm glad to report that I don't think that ended up being the case.
There's a quote in the book that I really love that says something like, if a tragedy like this had to happen anywhere in America, it's a good thing it happened here, meaning that Squirrel Hill was the neighborhood and Pittsburgh was the city. This was the community that actually had the wherewithal, the resilience, the grit to pull through. So as so many of us are mired in darkness, so many of us feel anxious and insecure about the future. Of course, nothing in the order of magnitude of a tragedy like a mass shooting, but these are not easy times. Are there some concrete lessons we could take from the community? Are there some observations we could glimpse from the book and say, like, that is how we should be in our daily life to make sure we have the same resilience and strength?
I think so. And I didn't set out to write a preachy book, and it's not a book with an agenda. It's not a book with policy recommendations. It's really just about the stories of all these people I met, of nurses and doctors, first responders, police, high school students who organized a vigil the very night of the attack, rabbis, the medical clown who was from Israel and came in to perform for people to help alleviate their stress, the therapy dogs. I mean, it's really about this amazing patchwork, this quilt of interesting people and creatures, and non-human creatures, I should say. But I would say that if we are to draw any lessons from these people about how to live, the important thing is to be connected to other humans, and that often is done through institutions. One thing that was very amazing to me was how few people ever mentioned the internet when I asked about their healing or their recovery or their process after, through grief, through trauma. Almost nobody said to me, well, I joined this amazing online group, or I made this friend through Instagram. Like, right. Maybe zero people. I mean, it's really, when I say not almost nobody, it might actually be nobody. I'm allowing for the possibility.
You know what made me feel better? Twitter. A lot of time on Twitter.
Right?
Yeah.
What people said to me was, I kept going to synagogue, and so I saw friends and they helped me through. Or, thank goodness I'm in this book club that meets at the public library, which, by the way, is in the heart of Squirrel Hill. Or, I mean, in my own case, I would go in between interviews to hang out at this great used bookstore, Amazing Books and Records. And the owner, Eric Ackland, kind of like heard me. He was always there at the counter. I would always like dump all of my thoughts about the work I was doing onto him. He became kind of my bibliotherapist. But I think have access to other human beings in real time, in real life. And so for some people, that's going to be through institutions like churches and schools and JCCs and YMCAs. And for some people, it's going to be arranging their own their poker club. I mean, it's funny, this didn't make it into the book. I was just thinking about this because some of these guys came to my reading last night in Pittsburgh. But I went to this amazing Wednesday morning breakfast group that meets at the Eaton Park on Murray Avenue. And it's a bunch of guys who all went to junior high together at Whiteman School in the 1950s, with my dad, by the way. And like of the 8th grade class of 20 people, 9 of them are still having breakfast together every Wednesday. And it's their men's club. And, just having those social ties, there's a lot of evidence. This was hardly my discovery. This is science that, people who are in community with other people are more resilient, their blood pressure's better, their anxiety's lower, all sorts of things. So I think that if anything, the book just demonstrates a kind of intuitive truth that we all know that, people who need people are, how does the song go? People who need people are the happiest people in the world, or something.
I believe they're the luckiest. The
luckiest. There we go. But it's not luck. You have to make it, it's intentional, and you make it work, and you live places where you bump into other people, and you leave your house and you join and you volunteer your time, and it's intentional.
And yet so many of us choose not to. So many of us have different arrangements and are then surprised when we're unhappy.
Yeah. I mean, look, it is it is, unfortunately, human beings, we have vices, right? This is, and religion teaches us this, that we have vices, and we fall prey to the idea that spending 20 consecutive hours gaming, or spending all your time, playing Keno or video gambling, or, I mean, you just driving around this country. I've been through 6 or 7 states in the past few days. It's amazing, the proliferation of gambling, of casinos, which used to be Las Vegas and Atlantic City, and now it's like almost every state has legal gambling, and with it the legal marijuana. So it's like you can be stoned and gambling all the time. And I'm not against being stoned or gambling, but it's all in moderation. And we are definitely, human beings are not always good at moderation, and they often retreat into these spaces of narcissism or self-soothing or self-medicating that separate them from other people. And I don't think in the long term that's the most joyful or meaningful existence, if you kind of give in to those things that separate you from other human beings.
I want to cede some of the floor for a little while to some of the amazing questions that are coming in. One from Danielle Papo. Mark, can you describe your process for discovering, finding, or selecting individuals to interview? This is fascinating to me too, because as you said, you have spoken and met so many people. What does this auditioning, casting process look like? How do you decide, medical clown and puppies, you're in,
right,
but guy who brought cupcakes, I'm sorry.
I hire the casting agent who worked on Arrested Development, and she vets. No, that's it's person to person. It really is. It's I started with a few people, names I just got from Pittsburghers I knew, people I knew who'd grown up in Pittsburgh or lived there recently. And I said, who would be on the ground, preferably in Squirrel Hill, but anywhere in greater Pittsburgh, who would be interesting to talk to about this stuff? And I got 4 or 5 names that way. And I interviewed them. Oh, and then I found 1 or 2 other names in articles, people I'd seen interviewed in the local press, which did such a good job, by the way, the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, Toby Tavachnik and Adam and Jim and all of the people at the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, and the Post Gazette and all the local media. So I saw some names in those places. And through recommendations and drawing on people who'd already been quoted, I ended up with maybe a dozen starting points. And I would interview them, and they were great. But my last question in every interview, and I think this gets to the heart of my process, my last question is always to say, who else should I talk to? Or as my grandmother would correct me, whom else should I talk to? And that way I'd kind of, it's spun outwards and outwards. Like every person I talked to gave me the names of 4 or 5 other people. And the list exponentially grew until I very quickly had several hundred people, not all of whom I ended up speaking to. But that gave me the big list. And so it really was a kind of unscientific, organic growth person to person of just asking for recommendations and getting to know, burrowing into the community that way.
Don Wolf Spector and a few others want to know, as you were going through this process, as you were talking to all these people, as you were learning really how all of this community and many of the outsiders who flocked in to help were doing in the aftermath of this tragedy, was there one thing that really kind of surprised you, that you looked at and said, like, I would never in a million years imagine this would occur?
I had thought almost zero in all my years as a religion reporter about death in communities, and particularly in the Jewish community. I knew next to nothing about the Chevra Kadishas, the holy societies or burial societies that exist quietly, anonymously, under the radar in many Jewish communities, that continue to perform the ancient Jewish rite of tahara, the cleansing of the body for burial, in which they wash the body and say psalms over the body and then sew the body into a linen or muslin shroud and prepare the body. And also the shomrim in those groups who watch over the bodies from the time they're dead until they are buried in the ground, because we're not supposed to ever leave bodies alone. And this is a whole network in not only in Pittsburgh, where there are 2 Chevra Kadishas, one of more traditionally observant or Orthodox Jews, one of more liberal practicing Jews, but also nationwide. There is the liberal Chevra Kadisha is part of a nationwide network of Chevra Kadishas, and they have annual conventions where they talk about best practices and they give each other tips. And if there's a Chevra Kadisha that's starting up, and a lot of this is about the movement to reclaim death from the funeral home industry, which does good work. I don't mean to attack the funeral home industry, but historically Jews buried their own. They didn't pay someone, they didn't pay professionals. It was done within the community by the Chevra Kadisha, who were members of the community, by lay people. And so the movement to reclaim death practices from a professionalized for-profit industry is very strong in Pittsburgh and Baltimore and some other places. And they're all in touch with each other. And just this whole kind of silent, quiet network of people doing this purely on a volunteer basis blew my mind. And I felt like could be a book unto itself. I don't think I'm the one to write that book, but I remain intensely curious about it.
This leads me to wonder, for years you wrote the beliefs column for the New York Times, and as columnists for newspapers do, your practice was to, find a good story, report it for a short period of time, and then move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And here you did something that was completely different, something that required really being on the ground, really listening, really sort of embedding yourself with this community. Did it feel emotionally different? Did you have any kind of insights about the work that you do as a writer just by doing it this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I as a former high school runner, I always talk about how everyone has their every writer has his or her distance. Some people are sprinters; they write 700-800 word pieces or listicles. Some people are middle distance; they write magazine pieces. Some people are marathoners and write books. Some people are ultra marathoners. They're Robert Caro, who's on his fourth volume on LBJ, and I've always I'm not very good at the really short piece. So when I was writing that column for the Times, I did my best, but I never felt like 900 words was where I did my best work. I always felt like I was leaving things unsaid. And I think some people have a great gift. You, Liel, have a great gift for that sort of pithy 900 word or 1,000 word piece, as well as for longer pieces. So the opportunity to go long was really exciting for me. And it felt better. And a lot of the writers I admire are people who write longer magazine pieces and books. And so I think it was nice to not have the pressure of thinking at all times, how am I going to turn this into writing, to be able to report for for a year and a half before really sitting down to craft it into writing. And just having that long runway of reporting was really, even though I was writing about something that was not soothing, it was creatively soothing to be able to think of the ultimate artistic project as having several years to come together in total from conception to publication, rather than sometimes a few hours with a newspaper article. Yeah.
So I'm noticing so many of you are joining us right now from Pittsburgh and from Squirrel Hill, or people who grew up there. So first of all, thank you so much for making time to join us today. And your questions are terrific, and there are so many of them. Mark, I'll try to make sense of them. First of all, one anonymous attendee wants to know, how do you think, it's maybe too soon to tell because the book just came out. How do you think the book has been received by the community?
I mean, the only evidence I have to go on is the people who reach out to me and talk to me, email, call. Last night at Riverstone Books on Forbes Avenue, we had a wonderful crowd of several dozen, maybe it's 50 people, and it's a tiny store, but it's very crowded. And people have said nothing but the nicest things. I've had two negative emails out of probably now 20 emails, and then phone calls and people coming up to you in person saying nice things. So if we're talking about the reception in Squirrel Hill, I said last night, I began by saying I have known for months that if anyone was going to throw Rotten Tomatoes or eggs at me, this was their chance, here. And I had to stand up on a chair to see everyone and to do my reading, and so I was a big target. There are two people who sent me, quite critical emails, and there've been a few people have caught. I think that about 3 minor errors have been caught. I say minor, but maybe they're big to the people who caught them. In one case, I said that a couple that had been married 60 years was married 62 years. Not the couple that died, by the way, but a different couple that came up in the book. So, that's useful feedback. That's one wants constructive feedback. One wants people to catch errors of fact or interpretation. I guess what I could say is overall, I've been very gratified at how generously the book has been received.
Several listeners want to know, at least one of the victims, I believe, was a Holocaust survivor, correct?
No, that was an urban legend that got started by, again, well-meaning reporters on Deadline in the immediate aftermath. There was some writing that Rose Mallinger was a Holocaust survivor. She was not. No one who was killed there was a Holocaust survivor.
The questions that are coming in still have to do with how we understand tragedy and why it had happened. A paraphrase, Alan Apple, for example, writes, after the Holocaust, many religious Jews asked, why us? and came up with different answers. This is a question several of our listeners are posting as well. I'm sure many in the community are either, first or second or third generation survivors. And we're kind of tempted to draw parallels about the state of anti-Semitism or murderous anti-Semitism then as now. Is that something that came up in your conversation, something that you find yourself thinking about? Sort of where does this fit into the grander scheme of murderous Jew hatred?
I mean, less than you think. I thought about it. Let me be clear. I think it fits in, but I thought about it less than you might think because I was really so focused on getting people's stories. What were you doing that morning, that week, that month, that year? And when people responded with theological observations or inquiries or questions or conundrums, that was part of their story. But most people don't respond to daily life that way. I don't tend to respond to daily life that way. Daily life is much more about picking up an extra gallon of milk, making sure the dogs get walked, trying to get your kids to stay in bed the third time you tuck them in, Liel, as you know. And so, no, in some ways it's, I think the book would be an interesting source for reflection for very theologically minded people. But the theology that's there is all pretty implicit. And I think it has to, I don't think there's any great answers to the problem of evil. I think it's one that we live with and contain and, carry like on our backs. We hump it like a backpack in the things they carried, but we don't ever solve it or shed it. I think to me, that's not a problem for Judaism, for the practice of Judaism. It's not a reason not to do Judaism.
Karen Singer wants to know, she writes, in your remarkable book, you say that the knitted Jewish hearts for Pittsburgh were perhaps the most special of things brought into the city. Tell us a little bit about it, and why do you think it was so impactful, and is it an ongoing project?
So yes, the crafting project of people who make these hearts for Pittsburgh is actually one of the very few things in which the web proved not only useful but invaluable in the aftermath. So much of the caring and the healing was done person to person, but it is indubitably the case that the Facebook group that organized the mailing of all of these hearts that were either knit or crocheted or made out of popsicle sticks or made out of paper, all these little stars of David and hearts that were then hung from yarns all over statuary and street lamps and trees throughout Squirrel Hill and greater Pittsburgh. Was organized, that was organized by wonderful people working on the web who got them all delivered, and then there was a team of people who fanned out over Pittsburgh to hang these hearts and stars of David, and that was just a beautiful thing. And I write in the book about what it was like to be in Squirrel Hill on a winter's eve and have a light snow falling or a light rain. And, excuse me. And
bless you.
And thank you. And you'd look up and see, the precipitation, the snow or sleet or rain, and you'd see it bouncing off the lights, and then you'd see the light also kind of being caught by these stars and Magen David hanging from trees and street lamps, and just kind of the mix of it all. I think I called it a heavenly wintry mix. So it was very beautiful. And that Facebook group, again, it's hard to imagine how that could have all been organized as quickly as it was and as well as it was without the internet.
I have a couple more questions for you. I know, again, that A, your time is pressing, and B, that we promised everyone that we would keep this a short and snappy conversation. So two more questions coming in, one from our listeners and one from moi. Several listeners want to know about the sort of prevalence or lack thereof in the book of these kind of like very big sort of policy related issues, especially gun control. But, these were conversations that were happening, certainly in Pittsburgh in the aftermath. And yet, when you read the book, it doesn't feel like the book is sort of permeated with this kind of sense of steely political, big ideas. So some listeners asking, was that something you grappled with, or did that just seem secondary to the conversations that were actually happening on the ground?
I mean, the big policy questions intrude into the book in much as they intrude into our lives at punctuated points. Again, I think most of life is, trying to get by, trying to, get the daily chores done, trying to carve out some time for hobbies or for relaxation or binging TV, reading a novel. And I think not consumed with policy questions. of course, in the aftermath of something like this, people begin thinking about politics, people begin thinking about gun laws, people begin thinking about how can we change society, mental health supports for the better. And it definitely comes up in the book in some places. So most prominently, it comes up in not the last chapter, but the next last chapter, which is about the 1-year anniversary and the memorial that's held where a bunch of people give speeches. And the expectation from the organizing committee was that the speeches not mention politics or gun control at all. And one rabbi, Jonathan Perlman, went off script, and it sort of there just disputed disagreements about how specific the script had been and how far off it he went and how intentional it might have been. But he very much said, we need stronger gun laws. And some people gave him a standing ovation, and some people turned their backs, and that was a very dramatic, or sat down and kind of sat on their hands. Few people walked out. So it comes up, but I also think it'd be untrue to people's lives to act as if most people's lives are saturated with politics and policy every minute of the day. I just think that's a media misunderstanding. Just because our lives are so attuned to the news cycle and Capitol Hill doesn't mean that's the way most people go through their daily lives. And I think the book was an attempt to be true to people's lived reality.
One last question. This is the third anniversary of the shooting, which is kind of a weird, I think, moment in the life cycle of a tragedy. It's not the first. It's not the sort of, oh, wow, I can't believe it's already been a year. And it's not the 20th or 30th where the historical vision is already kind of solidified. How do you think this would be remembered in the long term? What would be the kind of meaning or the significance of this day in American Jewish imagination, say 15, 20, 30 years from now?
I think it will be it is another date. The date may be forgotten, but I think Pittsburgh, Tree of Life, anti-Semitic slaughter, because this is by far the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history, will be there much like the lynching of Leo Frank in 1915 in Georgia. And some sense that like the American Jewish people were held wrapped by the 6-day war, when the sense, will Israel survive? Israel's really, really imperiled. And then of course it'll kind of have a place on the calendar alongside 1939 to 45 and World War II and the Holocaust. And so, I think it's probably the first new date that if you were teaching American Jewish history, you'd expect kids to get it on the final, right? It's sort of, October 27, 2018. But, I'm also very mindful that we are not a historically minded people here in America. We look forward, not backward. Most people forget most mass killings. I mean, of the several hundred that have occurred since 1999, I often pose to myself the question, how many cities could I name? Once you get past Columbine and Parkland, could I name 5 more, 10 more? That's about it. Certainly not 20 more. And so, we have to be modest about our hopes for historical memory. But I do think that for people who are concerned with, Judaism and our wonderful, largely free and secure history in America, this is a very important, new, sad milestone.
Mark, before we say goodbye, I want to share with our listeners that tomorrow we have a very special episode of Unorthodox, which is all about Squirrel Hill. It's based largely on your book and on, I think, fair to say, never before heard audio from your reporting. You will hear, as you could see on the slide, you'll hear from the local high schoolers, for example, who planned that Saturday night vigil that drew thousands of people from all across town and communities nearby. You'll hear from the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette explaining how he conceived that iconic, famous Hebrew language front page headline, and from my personal favorite, the archivist responsible for cataloging the thousands of pieces of mail and art and tributes that sort of flowed in from all over the world. How do you decide what to save and what not? I will say, before I say our final thanks, that the book should be purchased immediately. You could do so, ideally at your local bookseller, but if you must, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, and more. You could also listen to the book narrated by one Mark Oppenheimer on Audible, and you can find a lot more on markoppenheimer.com. If you have a friend who would be sorry she or he or they missed this, tell them to find our talk on Tablet's Facebook page at facebook.com/tabletmag, or our YouTube channel, youtube.com/user/tabletmag. Again, A final thank you to our community partners, Temple Israel Center of New York. We love you. Temple Israel Center of White Plains, New York. We love you. Weinstein JCC of Reading, Pennsylvania. We love you. Peninsula Sinai Congregation, Foster City, California. We love you. Agudat Achim Altoona, Pennsylvania. We like you. I'm kidding. We love you, of course. Mark, before I thank you, I want to really sincerely and from the bottom of my heart thank everyone who's joining us today. Members of the J Crew, our wonderful family. You know, we couldn't tell you how incredibly important it is and how meaningful it is for us as we report and live through these difficult times, from shootings to pandemics to rickety political and socioeconomic and racial tensions, to know that we're all in this together with you and that we have the comfort of your company. And with that, Mark Oppenheimer, I cannot thank you enough for writing this beautiful, beautiful book and for joining us today.
Thank you. And yes, thanks again to our supporters and also to everyone who joined us. Just giving us time out of your day is a huge gift. And we're grateful to everyone in the J Crew, as we call our podcast listeners.
How about you sign us off as you always do with one hearty shalom, friends.
Oh, there we go. That's right. Some of you will know, the elect among you will know that we always say goodbye by saying shalom, friends.